He sat alone in the half-light of a room that was never meant to be his. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of an old refrigerator somewhere in the apartment below. He had once commanded boardrooms filled with the brightest minds in the world, his every word sparking movements of billions of dollars. But now his voice did not carry further than the cracked walls that surrounded him. A thin mattress sagged beneath his weight, its springs pressing through, and he stared at the ceiling as if it might still hold the stars of a future that had long burned out. Bill Gates, once a name synonymous with vision, wealth, and inevitability, was no longer untouchable. He was a man haunted by echoes. Echoes of applause, of ambition, of the relentless ticking of time that had given him everything and then stripped it all away. There was no staff waiting outside his door, no convoy of black cars ready to ferry him from one engagement to another. There was only him, his memories, and the gnawing truth that empires do not crumble in one night, but piece by piece, like glass, breaking slowly under invisible pressure. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness of his mind, he returned to where it had all begun. Not to the fall, but to the spark. To the boy who saw not just a machine, but the future hidden inside it. Bill had been restless as a child, restless and insatiably curious. He was not the strongest, nor the most charming, but he carried something far more dangerous, an obsession. At the age of 13, when others were still tangled in the ordinary rhythms of adolescence, he discovered computers. Back then, they were not sleek devices fitted into every pocket. They were towering machines, strange and intimidating, locked away in rooms like forbidden artifacts. Yet to Bill, they were not machines at all. They were portals. Portals to a world of logic and creation, where lines of code bent reality itself. He would spend hours, days, staring at screens until the glow embedded itself into his eyes. Teachers complained. Friends faded away. He wasn't distracted, he was consumed. And that hunger, that relentless pull toward invention, would one day set him apart from every ordinary dreamer. He didn't want just to learn the machine. He wanted to own the future it represented. In college, the seed turned into fire. Alongside Paul Allen, his childhood friend, he made a choice that would define him. Harvard's gates, golden with promise, could not hold him. He walked away, carrying not a diploma but an idea. The world saw recklessness. Bill saw inevitability. He would build an empire from lines of code. And he did. Microsoft was not just a company. It was a revolution. In dimly lit offices, cluttered with half-eaten pizzas and buzzing with fluorescent lights, he pushed his team beyond exhaustion. His energy was volcanic explosive, consuming, sometimes merciless. He demanded perfection, demanded brilliance, demanded that every keystroke bend toward his vision. Those who couldn't keep up broke. Those who stayed built history. The 1980s and 90s became his era. Windows was not just software, it was dominance. His name began to appear on magazine covers, his face becoming a symbol of wealth itself. He was the man who bent the world of technology to his will, the billionaire who seemed less human and more myth. But glory always carries a shadow. Success bred not only power but arrogance. Behind the polished smile and the nerdish charm, there was steel. And behind the steel, there was something colder still. He wanted to win, not just to create. Competitors were not merely rivals. They were obstacles to be erased. Lawsuits piled up. Antitrust trials painted him as a monopolist, a ruthless tactician who crushed innovation beneath Microsoft's weight. To some, he was a visionary. To others, a tyrant cloaked in software. The higher he rose, the less he noticed the ground beneath him. His wealth swelled to unimaginable proportions, and with it came influence that stretched into politics, philanthropy, global health. He spoke about saving the world while building fortresses of power behind closed doors. He shook hands with presidents, dined with kings, and wore his philanthropy like armor against the criticisms that followed him like shadows. But no empire, no matter how vast, can silence the whispers forever. The cracks began quietly. A story here, a rumor there. Allegations of manipulation, of private indulgences that did not align with his crafted image of the world's benevolent billionaire. For years, he brushed them aside, wrapped in layers of influence and money. But time has a way of eroding even the strongest walls. One day, the whispers became headlines, and headlines became storms. The divorce tore through his public mask like fire through dry wood. Melinda, his partner of decades, no longer stood beside him. The split was not just personal, it was symbolic. To the world, it was the unraveling of the perfect image. Reporters dug into his associations, his past, his hidden dealings. The narrative shifted. He was no longer the untouchable genius, but a man exposed. And in the quiet of his solitude, Bill began to feel what he had long denied: isolation. His phone no longer rang with the same urgency. Invitations slowed. Those who had once clung to his orbit drifted to newer stars, younger faces with fresher visions. The tech world he had helped build no longer bent to his command. New giants had risen: Apple, Google, Amazon, each carving the future without him. The empire he once ruled had become history, and history is merciless. He walked through his vast estates, the walls lined with priceless art, and felt no comfort. The silence inside them was louder than any applause he had ever received. What was wealth when it could not shield him from his own reflection? He had built everything to be seen, to be admired, to be remembered. And yet, in the end, he was alone in rooms too large to hold warmth. And so here he sat now, not in a mansion, not in a palace of glass and steel, but in a dim apartment that smelled faintly of dust and regret. The bed sagged beneath him, his hands trembling not from age, but from the weight of memory. He remembered the first time he typed a line of code and felt the universe shift beneath his fingers. He remembered the first billion, the first headline that crowned him the richest man in the world. He remembered the laughter of Melinda when they were still young, when ambition was a shared dream rather than a battlefield. He remembered all of it, and it burned. What he had not expected, in all his calculations and predictions, was the cruelty of time. Time that stripped away not just relevance, but meaning. He had lived for conquest, for empire, but empires fade and conquests are forgotten. What remains are the ghosts of choices made in the hunger for more. Still, there was a strange clarity in the silence of his fall. Without the noise of applause, without the intoxication of power, he could finally hear the faint voice that had been buried for decades. The boy staring into the glow of a computer screen, eyes wide, not with greed, but with wonder. That boy had wanted to create, to build, to see the future come alive. Somewhere along the way, the boy had been lost in the shadow of the man. Bill opened his eyes in the half-light of the room and exhaled. His empire was gone, his image shattered. Yet he remained, flesh and bone, haunted but alive. The fall had stripped him bare, but in the ruins, there was still the question he could not escape. What is left of a man when everything he built is gone? The silence did not answer. It never did. The nights were the hardest. They stretched on endlessly, a theater of memories that played against the darkness. Sleep never came easily, not when the past had so many unfinished sentences, so many unanswered questions. He had tried to bury himself in philanthropy, in carefully staged interviews, in foundations that bore his name like monuments carved out of guilt. But when the lights dimmed and the cameras left, the applause turned hollow. What good was saving the world if he could not save himself? He thought often of the trial rooms, the courtrooms where his empire had been dissected piece by piece. He had stood with his hands folded, his expression neutral, while prosecutors painted him as the villain of innovation. He had convinced himself then that it was jealousy, that history would vindicate him. And for a time, it had. The world still crowned him as a genius. But now, with the haze of power stripped away, he wondered, had they been right all along? Was he not a visionary, but simply a tyrant with better tools? There were other questions that lingered, darker ones. What had he sacrificed in the climb? The friendships abandoned, the family moments skipped, the laughter silenced by the glow of computer screens. He had built a kingdom, but in its construction, he had walled himself inside it. Even Melinda, once his closest ally, his partner through storms, had eventually walked away, leaving him to face the quiet alone. In the stillness of the apartment, he sometimes replayed their last conversations. The words were never shouted, never violent. They were sharper than that. They were weary. Her voice carried the fatigue of decades of compromise, of being the supporting character in a story written only in his name. And when she left, it wasn't just a divorce. It was the collapse of the last pillar that had held the image of Bill Gates together. There was no scandal dramatic enough to capture what came after. The world wanted explosions, betrayals, financial ruin. But his fall was quieter, more insidious. It was the slow erosion of relevance, the steady trickle of influence slipping through fingers that had once clenched the world like a fist. No one told him it would feel like this, that fading was not a sudden death, but a long, painful unraveling. The headlines no longer called him the richest man alive. Younger names took his place: Musk, Bezos, Zuckerberg. The empire he once controlled had become just another relic of the past, another lesson in the speed of progress. He watched them rise, watched them command the same headlines, the same applause, the same envy he once had. And he knew deep down that they too would fall. That one day their empires would crumble, their names would gather dust, and they would sit where he sat now alone, staring at the weight of their choices. What haunted him most was not the loss of wealth. He still had more than enough to outlive generations. What haunted him was the loss of meaning. Money had always been a tool, but now it was a prison. He could buy anything, but nothing he bought filled the emptiness. He could fund cures, but he could not cure regret. He could influence governments, but he could not govern his own loneliness. Sometimes he thought of Paul Allen, Paul, who had been there from the beginning, who had shared the dream when it was still fragile, still pure. Their friendship had been fractured by ambition, their bond corroded by power. Paul was gone now, buried beneath the weight of time, and Bill wondered what might have been different if he had been less ruthless, less consumed. The empire might have been smaller, perhaps, but maybe the man would have been larger. The whispers of the past never left him. Whispers of competitors crushed, of employees pushed beyond breaking, of rivals silenced not by innovation, but by dominance. In the glow of victory, he had ignored them. In the silence of failure, they returned louder than ever. What had he truly built? A monument to himself, or a cage from which he could never escape? The reflection in the window mocked him. The man who stared back was older, softer around the edges, but the eyes were still the same sharp, calculating, unrelenting. And yet, behind them, something else flickered. Doubt. For the first time in his life, doubt had room to breathe. One evening, as the city outside pulsed with neon and life, he walked alone down a quiet street. No one recognized him anymore, not really. He was just another aging man in a worn jacket, carrying memories heavier than the briefcase at his side. And for the first time in decades, he felt the taste of anonymity. It was bitter, but also strangely liberating. He thought of the boy he had once been, sitting in front of that early computer, eyes wide with wonder. That boy had not dreamed of empires, of headlines, of power. That boy had simply wanted to create. Somewhere along the way, the purity of that desire had been consumed by the hunger to dominate. And now, in the ashes of everything, he wished he could speak to that boy. to tell him to hold on to the wonder, to never let the hunger eclipse the dream. But the boy was gone, and all that remained was the man who had everything, the man who lost it. The reconstruction, if it could be called that, was not about rebuilding wealth or influence. Those things were meaningless now. It was about facing himself, about staring into the ruins and refusing to look away. Each morning he forced himself out of bed, into the daylight, into the silence that no longer felt quite as suffocating as before. He spoke less, listened more. For the first time, perhaps, he was learning what it meant to be small. And yet, even in the quiet, the shadows remained, the headlines of the past, the betrayals, the mistakes that could never be undone. He would never again be the boy, the visionary, the king. He would always be the man who rose too high, who fell too far, who lived long enough to see himself become irrelevant. But maybe, just maybe, that was the truest kind of justice. For decades, he had bent the world to his will. Now the world bent him. It stripped away his illusions, his armor, his empire, until only the core remained. And in that core, fragile and imperfect, was a human being. No more, no less. When he lay down at night, on the sagging mattress in the dim room, he no longer dreamed of conquest. He dreamed of silence. He dreamed of peace. And though he doubted he would ever truly find it, the search itself became his final work. Not a work of code, not a work of empire, but a work of survival. Bill Gates, the billionaire, the titan, the myth, was gone. What remained was Bill, the man. And for the first time, perhaps, that was enough. The world outside continued, relentless and uncaring. Neon lights flickering over strangers' faces. New names rising to heights he once thought unreachable. But inside the quiet of his room, he whispered a truth that only those who have fallen can understand. In the end, it is not the empire that defines you. It is the ruins you learn to live with. And with that, he closed his eyes, not to dream of power, not to relive glory, but to face the silence, and to accept it as his final companion.